Thank you for listening to the Open Discourse podcast. I'm Charles Mitchell, co-founder and CEO of the Open Discourse Coalition. In this series, I interview thought leaders, elected officials, entrepreneurs, and other change agents. Today, I'm joined by Bill Morrow, Area Director for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So, Bill, you're the Area Director for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. You're wearing literally FCA on your chest today. That's great. You're also wearing red on a Friday, which, of course, the Open Discourse Coalition approves of. You can see I have mine.
Yeah, I see it there.
I'm a little subtle.
Yeah.
This is not your first career. How did you get into this particular ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought about that quite a bit over time, but I think as you get older, you fall back to the things that were most impactful in your life. And so for me, getting involved in athletics as a young man, you just did it because that's what you did as a young guy. My father was a coach. My mother was involved in athletics, my sisters. And so I became very athletically driven, but very driven for the win or for the notoriety. The other thing, too, is because of a kind of a dysfunctional family situation, anything I could do that could try to get my father's attention was what I did. Mm. And if playing would not get his attention, well, what if I was like a two-way starter? Would that get his attention? If that gets his attention, well, what if I was captain of the team? But growing up, I just felt this unbelievable pressure to overachieve, to try to get my father's acknowledgement in some way. Mm. It would have been so cool to hear like, good job once in a while. And that was, again, a different time. But when I went to college, I went with that pressure. And at the end of our first football practice, I started my collegiate career at Washington and Lee University. One of the players stood up and he said, there's this ministry called the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And he described it briefly and he said, does anybody want to attend? And I thought, that would be great. I have a man of faith at that point. I knew who Jesus is anyway. He's, the guy on the cross. But he wasn't part of my life. So I went, and what was amazing to me is it was all guys. Washington Lee was an all guys school at the time. But they talked about knowing Jesus in a firsthand way. And they seemed to compete for a different reason than me. Fast forward a year or two later, I decided to make Christ Lord of my life. And I realized I did not always have to compete for my father's attention. There was something bigger than that. And it was this guy called Jesus. And so FCA formed my perspective of my faith. It became a place where I could live out my faith. Once I medically retired, transferred to Bucknell, came there not knowing who I was. FCA gave me a home. It was a lot of athletes in a similar situation myself, ones that were just searching and wanted to maintain that relationship with Christ, and I was able to do it through FCA.
At what point did you transfer, Bill?
At the end of my sophomore year. So I did 2 years at Bucknell, my last 2 years.
So there is a lot more to your story. I don't know all of it, but I know enough to know there's a lot more. But you just put out a whole ton. Let's go back a little bit if you don't mind. So you talked about growing up, playing sports, your dad, all that. And where was that? Where did you grow up?
I grew up just outside of West Point, New York, in the Hudson Valley, in a relatively small town, Washingtonville, in Orange County, New York.
And how did you end up at Washington and Lee?
It was one of the few places that recruited me. I'm a 170-pound lineman, kind of the classic overachiever. And, I was about the same size as the running backs, I think, at the time. But a coach came in and showed interest. And that struck me today. I still have the recruiting notes. This guy, Frank Mariello, hand wrote me a note when he got done visiting with me. Things that are patterns that were established back then, that I've tried to use in my own life. And there's nothing like walking up to a young guy or girl at the end of an athletic performance, a music performance, and appropriately putting a hand on their shoulder and saying, nice job, great job. Things that I didn't hear necessarily from my father, but never go out of style. Yeah. And this coach, Mariello, showed interest in me. And I thought, boy, if he's showing him interest now, maybe he will when I got to college. He did. Great man, passed just last year. And really set the tone for how I treat others in many ways.
So we're going to come back to the hand on the shoulder, and we're going to spend a lot of time on it. But a couple other details of your story that I want to make sure listeners understand. So you mentioned being medically retired. At what point did that happen?
Yeah, it's funny. My goal was to play college football, and I played 18 minutes. I got hurt a few minutes into the second quarter of my very first game. My sophomore year, I can say I started, for whatever that means, in college football or playing a small school, Emory and Henry, and got my legs cut out from under me. And my career finished with an ambulance ride to the hospital.
Wow.
And at that time, given the nature of my injury, it could not be repaired to the extent that, I'd have any kind of mobility and speed. So my career was over. And that was very difficult. Even though I was a Christ follower at that point, you still always ask yourself, why? Lord, why? Show me, what am I supposed to get from this experience? And a lot of times, that's where the word faith comes in. You just wake up each morning and say, okay, Lord, just let me take another day and maybe I'll get the why then. And I think part of my why was coming to Bucknell, where I work now, as a campus director for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. My work is so much more effective having been a student there for 2 years, not necessarily an athlete, but having spent time on that campus.
Is your work also more effective having been medically retired?
Without a doubt. I have so much more empathy now than I had when I was 19. Again, part of that's maturity. But, so much of my ministry are to the hurting and to the women and the men athletes that are on the sidelines that can't compete anymore. And I would never be able to minister them in a firsthand way without my injury. So, in hindsight, I'm very thankful for it. In a way, I got nothing I wanted from college. I was never an All-American, but I certainly got everything I needed. And that was to be a better man from it.
I'm sure that you didn't know that that's why you were transferring to Bucknell at the time. What was your reason for transferring Bucknell back then?
Yeah, part of it was a guy named Bobby Marks that some alum may know.
Yeah, sure.
Bobby was very instrumental in my life, which is a whole nother story we can maybe cover another time. But Bobby walked into my life as a high school senior. I transferred to Danville High School for my senior year. My parents separated. And Bobby walked into my life and started showing, again, interest in me. Became a mentor. And then when I transferred, Bobby said, well, hey, second time around, how about Bucknell? And, arranged for me to go over for a visit, fell in love with the school. Who doesn't? And then Bobby was just very encouraging throughout. And in fact, saw him 3 days ago. We spent some time together.
Excellent. All right. So I've sort of paused the life trajectory of Bill. Do want to roll it forward. But before we do that, I'm curious to get your reaction to something. You keep talking about the hand on the shoulder and the praise and acceptance that you were longing for as a young man. I've heard it said that every single one of us has a God-sized hole. Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Without a doubt. And it truly is a God-sized hole. I mean, we can try so many different things. I was in business for a while. I've seen so many men in the career field try to use money or success to fill that hole. Obviously substance abuse is huge. People use men, women. There's all kinds of things we try. But in my own personal experience and what I've seen in so many others, it's the personhood of Jesus Christ. We were designed by him. We were built from him. He has a plan and purpose for our life. And when we begin to align our lives with his plan and purposes, then our lives really take off in a trajectory that, is unbelievable. It's something that we can only dream about sometimes.
And is that what happened to you at Washington and Lee?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. I went from being a people pleaser, trying to always please my father or get noticed, to just saying, you know what, I'm just going to play for God's glory. I got hurt. Okay. I'm going to reset. What can I do at the Bucknell campus that will bring glory to God? Well, you know what? How about get involved in the ministry? How about to try to share my faith with others? Get involved in my academics. I was a geology major. Wasn't the greatest geology student, but I leaned in pretty well and just tried to make the best of my time there and try to bring joy to others. And I think for the most part, I did an okay job of that.
And what about after Bucknell? What happened next?
Yeah, that's when my life really accelerated. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in geology, and a bachelor's in the science in 1985 was kind of a dead end. There wasn't a lot of professional positions available. So I was a park ranger down at Gettysburg at the battlefield for a little while. Worked in business for a little while. I was a truck driver at a small business, but it was a great experience. Those were kind of where I learned to work with people, deal with people. Through the park ranger job, learned to publicly speak, but got married during that time. But my end goal, I realized.
Hold on. That sounds important.
Oh, it was very important.
Tell us more.
Yeah. So when I was a park ranger, living just off the Gettysburg College campus, a friend of mine suggested that I stay involved with FCA as a volunteer. And I said, well, how would I do that? He said, well, why don't you go to the college and go to one of their meetings? Okay. And there was probably free food somehow involved in that. So I went
to every young man's heart.
Exactly. When you're making $5 in the hour, $5 an hour working for the Park Service, free food is manna from heaven. So I go for my free food.
You were making $5 an hour in the 80s.
Actually, it's $5.50. I'm lying.
I was working several years later than that, making $4.25. So you were doing all right.
Hey, Bucknell education. I was a graduate.
Make up for inflation.
Yeah, that's right. So I walk into this FCA huddle meeting, and every time Bucknell works on a college campus, there's almost always a faculty or staff sponsor. And the woman that was responsible for the ministry at Gettysburg College was a woman named Kristen Ardell. And again, dating myself, she was having trouble working a 16 millimeter projector. She couldn't get the loop right.
We're going to have to explain to today's college students what that thing was, but that's all right.
That's another podcast, by the way. Yeah.
It'll take the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I got the projector working for her. We visited and got married 9 months later. She was amazing and still is today. We've been married close to 40 years at this point.
What a number. Love it. Okay. So we drew that out a little bit. That's an important part of your life. So you got married. Keep going.
Yeah, married. Decided I wanted to become a professional geologist, make that my career. So we traveled to New York State, went to one of the SUNY schools, a little campus just outside of Cooperstown, New York, in Oneonta. Spent 2 years there, got a master's in geology, and then became a practicing hydrogeologist. Worked on groundwater supply projects, transitioned that into running, help manage a drilling company where we provide environmental and geotechnical drilling services up and down the East Coast. And that was incredibly satisfying in that I could take a lot of the, let's say, the lessons learned and the joy of being part of a team and translate that into the business world. When you work in the drilling industry, no one works alone. Just given the size of the rigs, the tools, the nature of the projects, the success comes from the team that you build. And I felt as though things that I learned from playing sports, I was able to use in my professional career and have some success. I ended up leaving that as a vice president before coming to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in 2018.
So that's what you were doing all the way up to until making a decision to sort of come full circle and go back to FCA.
Yeah, actually, I never left. I worked as a volunteer.
Oh, really?
So while I was
never left.
Yeah, while I was working as a professional geologist, my wife and I, we as volunteers, we established a ministry presence in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse, in a small town, Cazenovia, where we would have mostly guys, some girls, but they would meet on Sunday nights in different homes. And the mission of FCA is to help athletes and coaches basically grow in their relationship with Jesus Christ. And we would do that through our Sunday night ministry. And then we would also do that through our camp ministry. For about 25 years, we would eventually we'd charter buses and bring kids from upstate New York down into Pennsylvania to camps that were run by the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. These are sports camps where kids would go and get better at basketball, football, track, whatever sport they signed up with, upwards. We had maybe as many as 600 kids at our camp sometimes. I also coached high school football during that time, which again gave me a real neat segue into the lives anyway of young men. Mm-hmm. If you want to minister to people, generally somebody told me it's a contact sport. You need to be present in people's lives and, shoot, riding a bus back from a far stadium on a Friday night, spending an hour with a kid, you really get a chance to get to know your kids you coach well.
And what age were you and Kristen ministering to at that time? Was it Syracuse students or younger kids?
These were younger. These were high school kids.
I see.
Yeah,
in your local community.
In our local community.
Well,
that's right.
As a proud Pennsylvanian, I certainly support the oppressed of New York coming to upstate Pennsylvania for camp. I mean, you gotta have some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
To live in Pennsylvania.
That's right.
And I'm glad you're here now. Why did you make the migration from upstate New York to Lewisburg, PA?
Yeah, 2011. Our daughter wanted to make a move, change schools. We looked at some different options. At that point, we had suffered through our probably 20th consecutive winter of 150 plus inches of snow. The cloud, anybody who talks about being in a cloudy area, live just off one of the Great Lakes and you'll know what clouds are.
Yes.
So we had the opportunity to set up somewhere in Pennsylvania for our business. At that time, we were doing a lot of work that was related to the Marcellus gas development. Mm-hmm. And so the greater Williamsport area seemed to be a good place to locate. Mm-hmm. We knew we wanted to live in a college town, and Lewisburg fit every single check mark that we could find for ourselves. So we moved there, and it's been home ever since.
Got it. All right. So you made the move. You never left FCA. That's a good friendly amendment there. But you went on staff after stepping away from business.
Yeah. And it's interesting living in Lewisburg. Maybe it's the federal penitentiary, but at age 55, there's a lot of men, primarily men, that go on and do different things. Mm-hmm. They just kind of age out of working in the prison system in one role or another. And so I'm sitting with these different guys and I'm thinking, in 2018, I'm going to be 55, already maybe have the itch to do something quote unquote different. I remember reading Bob Buford's book, Halftime, and how he used the first half of his life to set up the second half, and decided, I'm going to run that play. So from 2012 to 2018, kind of formulated a plan. And in 2018, quit my job. Working for FCA, it's a paid position. It's not like I'm volunteering now. You need to raise support. I need to raise a local budget every year to cover my salary and expenses. And it took about 6 months to do that. But it's been a thrill really wearing two hats. I have a unique position. About 50% of my time is spent on the Bucknell campus ministering to the coaches and athletes at Bucknell. But the other 50% of the time is still working within the local community. So I help directly lead ministry at Lewisburg High School, but then also facilitate ministry at Susquehanna University, Bloomsburg, Lycoming College, and we're on 9 high school campuses in the area. And so it's been great to work through other paid staff volunteers to try to coordinate, grow that, share the vision, and give kids hope, just like I had. One of the things that I've seen that's different over time with particularly athletics, it seems like there's a growing interest in being more holistic. I remember talking to a coach probably 20 years ago, and he talked about how great his kids were and that he'd been coaching for a couple decades and always had an open door policy. And you know what? After 20 years or so, not one kid came into his office. And he was bragging and seeming to imply how great his kids were. Well, that model doesn't work anymore. Kids don't come to coaches. You need to go to them. One of the best lessons I learned while coaching in New York was sit in the back of the bus. If you want to find the needy kids, you got to go to them. And we as coaches, I still do it today. I coached junior high football again this past year. You never sit in the front of the bus because you just end up talking to the bus driver or to another coach. Go in the back where the kids are and start ministering to them. And that's been an awesome experience. And so one of the things working with FCA is trying to share life experiences like that, just wisdom you pick up over time.
I want to go pretty deep into what your ministry looks like today, Bill. But before we do that, I think we need to maybe set the table a little bit. We have listeners of all faiths. Mm-hmm. We have listeners who have some deep affiliations with Bucknell, some who don't. We have listeners who are familiar with Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. We have some who are across the globe, right? So therefore, I think it would be really helpful for you to speak to this question. Why, in your position, is a non-religious, non-profit organization like the ODC useful to you? Why is it that we work together? What does ODC do that is tied to what you do?
Yeah, I've thought about that. Thank you for asking that, because I thought about that in preparation for this interview. I think the working even with younger kids, they want to be listened to, they want to be heard, they want to be honest, they want to be validated in some ways. One of the things that I learned first as a parent, but now working in ministry, you never want to be shocked by what kids tell you and share with you. And so when I look at the ODC, I kind of see, that open discourse comes to mind. And it's a pattern that I try to lead in my ministry. You lead with questions. People first know how much you care by the questions you ask, not by the lecture you give. And so when I go to the Open Discourse Coalition, it just reminds me over and over and over the power of a good question, and also the power that we need to be listening, we need to be learning. I mean, I minister to kids of many different faiths, and you love them all. Just because one holds one faith tradition over the other doesn't mean you hug them any differently.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm actually wearing my swag. I don't have FCA swag, but my swag on this on this day ties to our work together, because I would just say my reflection is one of the greatest ideas for a series of programming I got from visiting with you and the students that you minister to, some of the students from FCA as well as some from the Catholic Campus Ministry stuck their hands up. One actually read.
I remember
Friday,
that. Yeah, no, I remember that clearly.
And they said, "Hey, we have Bible studies, right? That we do with Bill. We have Mass. We have whatever. We don't have a place though to talk about what our faith has to do with business.
Sure.
And how can you have a career and all the rest of it and have a family? How does that all square?" That was the birth, I'm sure you remember it too, of the Faith, Family, and Business series, of which the Dempseys on my vest here were the most recent speakers. To me, that's a really powerful example of what it looks like for our missions to intersect, because I have some heritage with FCA which we can talk about.
Yes.
Right? But from my perspective, we don't work together because I'm a Christian, although I am. We don't work together because I was part of FCA when I was a student a long time ago, although I was.
Yeah.
Rather, we work together because you serve students who should have the right to practice their faith, ask questions, like you said, all the rest of it. We create a place where they can do that. And in the process, things come out that deserve some open discourse.
Right.
That aren't what you do.
Right.
And that's okay, but they need to be what someone does.
Yes.
And so to me, the way I think about that is organizations like yours with the bricks, ODC's the mortar.
Yep.
Right. We can fill gaps and knit things together and create conversations that I would say augment and come alongside what you do, or what the Catholic Campus Minister does, or the Chabad rabbi who's also a friend of ours, or whoever. But create a space where students can have these big conversations about their futures that they voice are hard to have. Does that make sense?
Oh, without a doubt. Because you think about many of the students at Bucknell, I mean, their first reference point is their family. So what if their family was not involved in business? What becomes the reference point then? Is it a social media influencer? Is it the dollar bill? How much money I can make? So I think we have a chance to proactively give them an alternate view of what success really looks like. Regardless, again, of your faith tradition. Most of the major faith traditions would not put the dollar bill as being the ultimate.
Yep.
That's for sure.
Yep. Okay, so I said I wanted to go deep into the ministry today.
Yeah.
Thanks for setting the table for some folks about why we're working together. I am amazed when I think about my Bucknell history. I don't know how it jives with yours. Yours is 2 decades longer than mine. When I visit FCA, when I stop by a huddle, or some of my colleagues do, when I was a student, on a good night, there were 10 of us, and there was no you. There was no one in your position didn't exist. I don't know if it did before you were in it. Whereas now, to see 50, 60 students in a huddle, to see some of the things that athletes do, on the 50-yard line or on the sidelines, it just is it is a totally different environment. And look, the ODC exists obviously because some of our fellow alumni are concerned about some of what they see in higher education today. And there are many things that are different from when you and I were in school. And I would say many of those things are not better. They're actually scary, and somebody needs to do something about it. But this is, like, to me, the great counterexample.
Yeah.
If you believe what, you don't have to, obviously, anybody can believe whatever they want. We stand for that. But for example, if you agree with the founders of this country that America is for immoral and religious people, if you think that that is, like, generally a good thing that should be positively received in society, well, it seems to me that that sort of part of the Bucknell community is much stronger than it was 20 years ago. I'm really curious for your reflections on that. Number one, what did you find when you showed up in 2018? How did it compare to what came before, especially when you were a student.
Yeah.
And how do you think about what you see today, day by day? Is it healthy? Is it vibrant? Am I, I don't know, am I just a reflective old man who's, sort of lost the lead?
Two of us.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But you know what I'm saying? But how do you think about what you see today?
Yeah. What I've experienced personally is, again, it's timeless, but students of all ages are looking for hope. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for truth, maybe with a little t, but they know it's out there. They know there's some absolutes. And they come to that reflection point at different times. Working in the athletic community, oftentimes, again, it's unfortunate, but it's built around injury or once you're removed from the team or you might be leaving the team for some reason. That's huge. Or the other thing, too, is, you've invested so much in your athletics, but you realize, that just kind of leads to another empty point because it's not giving me the satisfaction I wanted. It kind of goes back to that hole in your heart. And so, the students are looking more. But I think also, too, in a greater society, I can take a business class, I can become a professional geologist, I can take on these different careers, but at the end of the day, so what? And I think when you talk to a kid who's 20 years old, whose parents are maybe now 40 to 50, they're looking at their lifestyle and they might be very affluent, but are they happy? Or is it meaningful? Are they doing anything that makes a difference? And so I think the students that I talk to sometimes, they look at their parents or they look at older people, they look at kind of the generation ahead of them, and they don't automatically want that. They want something more.
So those are the questions that students are asking.
They don't know necessarily how to ask that. We ask that because we're older. But indirectly, they're inquisitive about that, or indirectly their actions seem to reflect that. I mean, like last night I was at a Bible study with a football team. It's about 10 guys. But why did they come? And this is after a long day, long practice. Sure. They've got homework to do afterwards, but yet they're going to grab another hour and sit in front of the scriptures and try to figure out life. And so often the questions boil back to that. It's not the scriptures we read, but how do we apply this? What's the greater truth that we can try to gain? And a lot of it reflects back a lot of times my ministry is strictly to the male athletes, but again, they're trying to figure out what does it mean to be male in our society, and is being male and a man the same thing, and where's that intersection point? You're born a male, but what are the actions that we do that make us a man?
Yeah. So let me read back to you what I think I'm hearing, Bill. It's a business, right? You're serving customers. So a lot of your customers, they're not coming to a Bible study necessarily because they're looking for the Bible.
Right. They're
looking for something that they think they can find in the Bible. And perhaps over time they realize that that's what they should be looking for in the first place. And that's what happened
that's true.
to you, right? But is that a fair reading of what you're saying? They're looking, they don't even know maybe how to describe it, but they're looking for something and they think they might find it in either Christianity or the Bible or whatever. No,
definitely. And then the other thing too is, across society, we're looking for small group connection. And so when we sit in our larger huddle on a Tuesday night or something, we got 50 kids in there. Yeah. If we don't break that 50 down into groups of 5 or 10, and give the students a chance to talk about something significant each week, there's some rumblings in the crowd. I mean, they're coming for connecting points.
Connecting points and truth is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and again, the truth, we sort that out. You can even read the scriptures, and some people read one way, some read the other. But we can have, again, this open discourse. We can talk about it, talk about from different faith traditions, different denominational differences, respect each other, and can't wait to get back together again next week.
Does the average student, Bucknell, let's put all your important work in high school aside, the average Bucknell student who comes to you, they're your average customer, right? Are they from a faith tradition usually when they come to you or not?
Most probably are. I've never kind of surveyed them statistically.
Right?
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's a bell-shaped curve. We've got a few that are just wandered in because maybe they came with a buddy. We got some that are just locked and loaded in their faith tradition.
Okay.
And then there's that middle, who oftentimes their faith tradition is more maybe their parents than their own.
Would you say that was kind of where you showed up at Washington and
100%.
Okay, so you can relate to that.
Very much. And so it's really fun to have them meet Jesus in a relevant way, engage with the scriptures in a relevant way, and then let them decide, who is this guy? But the Bible tells us we're all going to be held accountable at some point for what we've been given. And so for me and for those that work with me, our volunteers, it's just really fun to put that decision point in different ways in front of our students.
And what would you say over time, Bill? Are there, I don't know, I don't mean to be crass, but I do think of things in terms of business and customers, right? Do you have more customers than you did 7 years ago or 8 years ago?
Truly, and a lot of it has to do just presence. Again, we are a ministry of presence. By being available on the campus, last night eating in the dining hall, being in the library, being on different parts of the campus, makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Showing up at a baseball game where there's maybe 100 fans and you're the 101st.
Yeah.
It looks over and I look at the roster. Okay, whose parents are not there? Maybe because of distances. Excuse me. But I also look for the kids. I know their family structure. If there's no dad, it's pretty cool to look over and see a guy who's cheering for you. Or if there's not a mom present, I've between my wife and others, to be able to provide. Yeah. Everybody wants a box of cookies. Yeah. Because it's not so much the cookies, but it's the love that went behind them.
But let's go a little deeper. Is it just that FCA has more customers than it did 8 years ago, or do you think that the faith community at Bucknell generally is stronger than it was 8 years ago?
I would say the faith community overall is stronger.
Why?
I think as a maybe a society as a whole. Here's just a quick example, and this is not to go back and make football any more special than anything else, but you cannot come off the bowl season and just the way it's fascinating. Think about this: the way pre-game, post-game prayer was covered, let's say, by ESPN 2-3 years ago. Again, I don't know the statistics to back this up, but it seemed like when guys would pray, the cameras would divert. Now it's like people are running over and sticking their cameras in prayer huddles, or they're making a point before the game to show guys locking arms before the game even starts praying. And so I think, and again, it's never just prayer, but that be maybe one indicator that this public expression of all faith traditions, but of faith, just seems to be more accepted now than maybe it was, even just 10 years ago.
Do you think that's so across society, not just higher education?
I'd have to think about that. I don't have an answer right now, so I don't want to guess.
That's okay. It's fascinating because to me, I have a different, time horizon and origin story than you do. But man, I can't explain it. As much as I could say is must be the Holy Spirit. I don't know, but I certainly feel something very different when I walk around the campus of our alma mater, when I meet students, when I hear the different activities that are going on. I would say yes across the various Christian, Protestant, Catholic, we haven't even talked about our Orthodox friends.
Correct, yeah.
We both have some good friends in that community, one of whom has been a previous guest on this podcast. But the Jewish community, for me at least, there's something going on.
Yeah.
And sure, an obvious explanation is, or an obvious question one could ask is, well, what would have FCA look like when I was there if there had been an area director or a campus director? And what would that ministry of presence have done? That's great. Those are fair, and I'm grateful for your hard work, because I know it is work. It's a joy and a blessing and all the rest of it, but it's also work.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for that, right? But it feels to me that you're part of something bigger. FCA is part of something bigger. That's not to take away from you or FCA, but it just feels like something is going on. And I don't have the data to know is it beyond Bucknell? I don't have the data to know. Is it beyond higher education? So I appreciate your humility in saying you don't know either.
Can I inject one thing that's kind of something that struck me this fall? Coaching junior high football at Lewisburg, maybe 5-6 games into the year, I was walking backwards before the game. This was literally minutes before the game, and stumbled. And the reason I stumbled is I stumbled over a kid. But I turned around, and there's 20, 25 young men, 12, 13, 14 years old in a circle, and they weren't saying anything, but it was pretty clear they were praying. And I just walked away and, kind of mused on that a little bit. But where did that come from? Why? And it was interesting. Like I said, nobody led it. Certainly coach didn't lead it. Access laws, you don't. But it's just some kids said, hey, let's pray. And they decide, I guess, maybe if they see the college guys doing it on a Saturday night, maybe we should. So I think there's a hunger for that. And maybe, I know as an athlete, even if it's just a moment of silence, that calming presence, even before you speak publicly, that's like, just calm yourself, deep breaths, rest. We can communicate so much clearer when we do that.
Bill, as you know, there are some traditional questions that I love to ask on this podcast. You already know what they are. You've watched some of the other episodes. Before we go there, I just want to give you the last word. Is there anything else you wanted to say about your ministry before we move on?
If anybody's listening to this that doesn't have hope in the kids that I minister to and work with at the high school level, the college level, there's so many young men and women that are making unbelievably great choices. And I would just encourage you, talk to the kids around you, whether it's in the lobby of your church, it's stopping a kid in Perkins at the local restaurant, but engage with the young people today. And the other thing too is once you've engaged with them, don't stop. Find out what they're interested in. And lean into their lives in some way. It could be the kid in town that looks like he has it all together, mom, dad, apple pie, perfect house or whatever. You don't know what's going on in different people's lives. And the same could be true for at our age. But literally put that hand on the shoulder, stop that person, look them in the eye, and ask about them. And ask them. One guy told me the most powerful word you can ask somebody right now is use the word really. I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, so often in our society, I'll ask Charles Mitchell, hey, how you doing? And you're going to answer,
I'm fine.
Really? And as soon as you use that word really, what it does, it communicates to the other person that you care about them in some way. And it could be the woman that just serves you your meal down at the diner. But lean into those relationships, and you will be so blessed by that opportunity. Don't walk past it. And so if you have your one word of the year, replace it with the word really, and I think you'll see your life transform in a very different way in 2026.
Well, Bill, as you know, I usually ask people for some really influential advice. Number one, before you start talking about really, you gave some, which is talk to our young people, and I emphatically agree and love that. I don't know if you also, in the process, answered the question I was going to ask you for some really influential advice that you've received. Was it the word really, or do you have more?
No, I mean, let's just stay with that. I'm a pretty simple guy. If you give me a second thing, I'll probably forget it.
Wow.
So stay with the word really.
I think that is the most actionable advice I've yet heard shared.
Well, thank you.
Simple and profound. All right. Well, there are two other traditional questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your answers to them. What's a great book that you recommend to all of our listeners?
For me, my life changed it's when I took the Bible off the shelf and actually opened it. A dusty Bible is an unused Bible. And when I started to engage with the word, read it, apply it to my life changed. But I just want to interject one other book if I can.
Sure.
Probably 10 years ago now, an author, Bob Goff, put out a book called Love Does. And for me, what that allowed me to do is take what I learned in the scriptures. I'm a slow learner, probably took too many years. But how do you actually apply, the two greatest commandments are what? Love God, love others. But how do we actually love others? And the biggest thing is just get out of the boat, get off the chair, get out of the couch. Just do practical things to engage with others. And this book, Love Does, is a very whimsical book, but inspired me to involve myself in the lives of others in a way that has brought great joy to my own life, I believe, and maybe impacted some others along the way.
So I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question about that, Bill. The Bible is one of the most frequent answers to that question, which is delightful and surprising to me. It's what I start every day with. Ken Langone talked about it on this podcast. Buck Buckley talked about it. Many have talked about it. However, I would say few of us have as little dust on our Bibles as you. So that's the follow-up question is, if somebody hears you or Buck Buckley or Ken Langone or whoever recommend that book, I'm not taking away from your Bob Goff book. That's great. Yeah. Okay. But if they hear that recommendation and they say, you know what, mine's got a lot of dust on it, never read it before, where would you advise them to start?
Again, being a very practical guy, I would go into one of the small books towards the back, the book of James. It's not one of the Gospels. It's not one of the biographies about Jesus. And at some point, you need to meet that guy. Jesus is pretty cool. But the book of James is very, very practical. You cannot read that and not be a better person on the backside. And so I try to encourage people that are maybe breaking open the Bible for the first time, read James, and then just dive into one of those biographies about Jesus himself.
I can think of few things that I've ever done in my life that are less comfortable than reading James's letter.
Yeah.
And that's spoken like a true athlete, asking people to do something uncomfortable. Okay, Bill, last question. Your favorite world historical leader?
You know, again, working for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, I got to say Jesus, and I would say anyway, I say it tongue in cheek, but recently, I guess maybe because of the year that we're in, coming up on the 250th anniversary of our country, you know, I look at George Washington and how by simply not losing, he won. And there's so many great takeaways from that. And I look at just the setbacks that he faced, the resources that he had to compete with, you know, from an athletic standpoint. And none of us would be in the place we are today, you know, if it wasn't for him. And I just think he's a role model in so many ways, you know, man of his times, obviously has his faults. Talk about those another day. But the fact that he was able to accomplish what he did is unbelievable.
Well, I'm gonna leave it to you to hear for yourself, Bill, but I'll just say there's some fascinating overlap between you and a lot of the other guests on this show, and in both parts of that answer. I'm thankful that George Washington is seeing, I think, a little bit of a resurgence in this important year. Also thankful for your work with that other guy that you encourage people to meet. It's a joy for the ODC to partner with you as we both execute our missions in the Bucknell community. It's been a delight to have this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you so much for the awesome work that you do in your ministry of presence.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Charles. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to the Open Discourse podcast. This podcast is brought to you through the generosity of the Shearer Group of Companies in State College, Pennsylvania. If you'd like to keep it going, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and consider making a donation at opendiscoursecoalition.org/donate. See you next week.